All right, let's get this presentation started. Sorry, I was on the last page of the presentation there. This is my seventh take at this. I really wanted to perfect it. Anyways, here's my Project 3 synthesis. Before we start, I'd like to talk about a couple of the revisions I made for this PowerPoint and with my speaking. These will be more clearly stated and in writing with the cover letter I write for the Blackboard assignment that's turned in. But nonetheless, I did make some changes. One of them was to remove the source and add a new one in its place. And I also strategically place these sources the way I talk about it today in a specific order that I think will help the conversating between them and at the same time make it easier to follow what I'm going for with my thesis, which is essentially that marijuana should be legalized for medical use. Without further ado, let's get started. The sources we're analyzing today we got 4 to analyze today. One of them is going to be basically a timeline, I guess what is how to describe it, posted or published by pbs.org, titled Busted, America's War on Marijuana, and that was essentially a timeline that was it was just a rundown of the history of marijuana. We'll get to more of that later. The next source we're going to be looking at is a consensus statement by the National Association of School Nurses and their views on the legalization of marijuana. The third source we're going to be looking at is a scientific based source. There was laboratory studies done and conclusions published in a print journal in 1999. And last but not least, we're going to be taking a look at a New York Times article titled "A Judge's Plea for Pot" by Gustin L. Rybak. And in my final research paper, I do cite this and the scholarly source from which I gained a lot of information. But for this presentation, I decided to keep the same source in here, the one from the New York Times, although not scholarly, because it's easier to conversate between these sources with this one in there. With that being said, let's start this presentation. Busted, America's War on Marijuana, Public Broadcasting Service. So, PBS published this source, or not a source, rather, PBS published this timeline, giving us the rundown of marijuana's progression dating back to the Great Depression and where it stands today. What they got to say is marijuana has been a feared substance ever since the Great Depression, essentially being associated with Mexican immigrants and violence. And because of that, in 1937, Congress ended up passing the Marijuana Tax Act. It did not make marijuana illegal, but there was a high tax put on it, and only could it be sold for medical use. But at the time, and with the acceptance it had, and going into World War II, it was essentially criminalized. In the 60s and 70s, as we know, the hippie and disco era, there was a lot more acceptance for marijuana, although, of course, it was being associated with what some may consider a negative crowd, a negative vibe, and essentially once parents got their hands on this issue, they pushed for marijuana to be criminalized. And in 1986, Ronald Reagan, signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which instituted mandatory jail time sentences for any drug crime. Therefore, there was mandatory time for marijuana possession, distribution, or consumption, even among those medically ill. 3 years later, in 1989, when President George Bush took office, he declared a war on drugs, which, even though that had been happening the whole time, he was essentially stating that we are going to fight the border with this one. Drugs aren't going to be pushed over the Mexican border into the southern states of the United States of America. What effect it did have is not as important. That's essentially just what happened in 1989. But 7 years later, even with what had gone down with George Bush, California ended up passing Proposition 215. And as a state, they passed this. The voters passed it, allowing for the sale and medical use of marijuana only by the terminally ill. But that's the start of marijuana progression right there. According to PBS, that is the last thing they list before we go further into where marijuana is today. and what acceptance it has as a medical treatment for pain. But that's where we stand. With all that in mind, let's take a look at where we're going today. This is what the National Association of School Nurses, what their opinions on marijuana are and why it should remain illegal. Okay? They say that it is their opinion that marijuana is properly categorized by the DEA under Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, which therefore means they believe marijuana should sit alongside heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, among other drugs, including LSD, under Schedule 1, therefore receiving the harshest penalties of any kind for its possession and distribution. Essentially, they don't like marijuana, but they have more to say. That's just their opinion. They also go on to say that smoked marijuana has a high potential for abuse and has no accepted medicinal value for treatment in the United States. Keep that in mind, as there will be a source that can speak to that later. They also state that there's no scientific studies that support medical use of marijuana and no animal or human data that support the safety of marijuana for general medical use. We'll come back to that quote later. They finish it off by stating that marijuana does affect a consumer's short-term memory, attention and judgment skills, as well as coordination and balance. And they basically state that just to keep in mind that they don't, that's their stance on marijuana, and they want to prove that each and every way they can. But they got a couple things wrong here, and this source right here speaks right to it. This was published in 1999. Keep in mind this last source here was published in 2013. So in 1999, after marijuana progression started in California with Proposition 215, a couple of scientists went along and did a bunch of extensive laboratory studies in an attempt to find out what marijuana really did have as an effect on the body. Here's what they found out. In conclusion, after all of their studies were said and done, they found that an inhalation, preferably not smoking, of marijuana would be advantageous for treating chemotherapy-induced nausea. Now, if we take a look back here at the National Association of School Nurses, they said there's no accepted medicinal value for treatment in the United States, where it seems to me as these doctors right here, these scientists, did find some accepted medicinal value. They accepted it, and they're credible. Let's take a look at what they have to say next. They found out that the available evidence from animal and human studies does indicate that cannabinoids have a substantial analgesic effect. Now, if we take a look back at what the National Association of School Nurses had to say 14 years later in the year of 2013, they said that no sound scientific studies support and that no animal or human data support marijuana and its medical uses. Well, it looks like science has their back in this context, or science has proved them wrong here, because this source was published 14 years earlier, and there is direct animal and human studies that indicate that marijuana is effective for treating pain. Last but not least, they go on to say that nausea, appetite loss, pain, and anxiety can all be mitigated by marijuana. I chose to leave that in last because I believe that connects really well with the last source we're going to talk about today. And as we move between the conversation between this source and this source, let's take a look at what they have to say. Keeping in mind what they have to say, let's take a look at what this information is going to do and affect people like Gusinel Reichbach here, a former cop and judge in New York City, essentially found out that he had cancer one day. And it was probably the most devastating news he had ever found out. And even though he had been a cop and a judge, he found out that marijuana was the only thing that could help him with his pain. He states that, "I did not foresee that after having dedicated myself for 40 years to a life of the law, my quest for ameliorative and palliative care would lead me to marijuana. But it did." And keeping in mind that he was prosecuting people for their consumption of this and their possession of this as a judge. But now, even though he didn't want to believe it, he went on to smoke marijuana to find out that that was an effective treatment for pain. He claims that dealing with nausea and pain is one of the most difficult struggles he faces, and that every drug prescribed to him treats one problem but leads to multiple others with their side effects, such as loss of appetite, constipation, nausea, and a series of other problems that have to deal with his pancreas and its pain. Well, it looks like he made the right choice with marijuana, as the doctors clearly say here that nausea, appetite loss, pain, and even anxiety, which you can assume one that's terminally ill and knows they're going to die is probably under a lot of anxiety. Marijuana can help mitigate all of that. The last thing he has to say that inhaled marijuana, and this is probably the most important statement marijuana's ever been given for praise, and that's that inhaled marijuana is the only medicine that gives me relief from nausea, stimulates my appetite, and makes it easier to fall asleep. So, with all of these sources in mind, let's come to a little bit of a conclusion statement for this synthesis. Here's what the history of marijuana has brought us through. It was once thought of as very negative, then criminalized, laws were put on it, and essentially, California made the first step in proving that marijuana could be used as an analgesic treatment. Then we get a source that tells us, yeah, there is scientific studies that do prove that marijuana is an effective use for treatment of pain. And 14 years later, we still got people that do believe there is no scientific studies that support this, even though there has been journal articles published years before, ultimately leading to the borderline today. Should it be legalized? Should it be illegalized? That's not what this assignment's about. That's what the research paper's about, so you'll find out more in there. But both of these sources here, this negative one and this positive one, are both going to have an effect on whether Gustin L. Reichbach is allowed to use marijuana as a treatment for his pain legally. Because right now he's been using it illegally, and he, even the judge, wants it legalized. All right, thank you, Rachel, for listening to my synthesis today. I really appreciate it. I have, I'll go more into detail with my cover letter, my written cover letter about what changes I made. I already talked about a few. You can see them here. I also decided to use a microphone this time because I felt the voice capture was a lot better, made it more clear. My voice was a lot more clear, and so you could hear me better. And at the same time, I tried to polish up my speaking. I still kept in mind that I was trying to play the Stephen Colbert role, where I have a formal and, I respect the audience I'm speaking to, but at the same time, I'm using my words in a certain way to better speak between the sources. So, I hope you enjoy my revisions, and thank you once again for listening to one of my presentations. Have a great summer, and thanks for teaching me this year, man. I really appreciate it.